Hello, and welcome back to the Land and Climate podcast. My name is Alasdair McEwen, and in this episode, I spoke to Jessica Green about her new book, Existential Politics: Why Global Climate Institutions Are Failing and How to Fix Them. Jessica is a professor of political science at the University of Toronto. As well as being a regular climate politics commentator in North American media, she is also expert in carbon pricing and global governance. Her new book emphasises how climate policymaking should now be concentrating on using economic levers for significant progress to be made, and how policymaking should be focused away from the technicalities of emissions accounting to instead removing the economic power of fossil asset owners and then empowering green assets in the long term.
It is preposterous that we put a price on carbon at the same time as we spend literally billions of dollars subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. One is meant to make carbon more expensive and one is meant to make them cheaper. So they're literally working at cross purposes.
I started by asking Jessica Green to introduce the concept of existential politics.
Existential politics was born out of frustration that I saw in political science and international relations. More specifically, that everybody was thinking about climate change. The common conception of climate change was as a collective action problem among states on emissions reductions. The solution, therefore, was for countries to come together in a multilateral arena and all pledge to reduce their emissions. And by doing that and having robust institutions and accountability mechanisms, you would deter free riders, and therefore everyone would go forward with decarbonization. That was the theory, grounded in economic theories of collective action, and the empirical reality did not bear out that theory. 30 years now of multilateral cooperation, and we have failed to bend the curve on emissions. Indeed, the climate crisis is worse than ever. As a political scientist, I had thought about that, and I had also looked at the politics quite extensively, and we say that politics is about who gets what and when. And that it seemed to me that this was much more a distributional problem than a problem of coordinating actors. And I'm not the only person who said that. There's a lot of people in our discipline increasingly who have written about that. I started this work with co-authors Jeff Colgan and Tom Hale and rewrote an article, which was the precursor to this thinking. And in that article, we said, hey, this is really about asset revaluation. And what climate change does is two things. It reduces the value of some assets, which are going to be destroyed by increasing wildfires and extreme weather and so on and so forth. And climate policy reduces the value of others. So this is the stranded assets argument that lots of people have made that says when you decarbonize all these fossil fuel assets and infrastructure and they all become worthless. This generates a huge conflict. They're not fighting about emissions. They're fighting about their bottom lines and in some cases their way of life. And that's really what existential politics is. After we wrote the article, I thought, this is a lose-lose. We have some people who want to maintain the status quo and some people who are just going to lose from climate change but don't have a whole lot of organizational power to affect big changes in the energy system. So I went back to the drawing board and said, okay, well, who's going to win from this? And how do we think about them as a set of political interests that can potentially drive decarbonization policy forward? This idea of the contest between green asset owners and fossil asset owners came into focus. It's fairly self-explanatory. Fossil asset owners are fossil fuel companies, mining industries, heavy industry that are the basis of the fossil economy. And the green economy looks different. It's renewable energy, the components of renewable energy, new technologies. But the problem is this fundamental asymmetry between these two groups of asset owners. We got this very big, wealthy, politically entrenched set of fossil asset owners and a relatively small, less influential set of green asset owners. So to me, the problem of existential politics is the fight between these two sets of asset owners and which one is going to win, both globally, but also at the national and the subnational level. So that's really where the idea came from. And how do we think about this problem of the power asymmetry between these asset owners? And if we're focused on assets, then let's look at the economy instead of emissions.
Okay. And so essentially, what you're saying almost is that
you're looking at re-incentivizing green asset owners or giving greater incentives to green asset owners and for them to grow and become the new powers compared to what fossil asset owners were, but also incentivizing that change?
That's part of the answer. If you think about this conflict between two sets of asset owners, it's not just that you build and empower green asset owners. You also have to constrain the power of fossil asset owners. And that's always been the elephant in the room. The mantra has been, if you build it, they will come. But from a political perspective, first of all, you can't build it because of the obstructionism of fossil asset owners. And second of all, if you do build it, it's not necessarily the case that, quote unquote, they will come. So part of what this book is trying to do is to say, look, we really have to think about the fossil out. How do we constrain them? And there's two pieces to that. One is, how does current climate policy enable the continued power and influence and entrenchment of the fossil fuel industry? And then how can we use other tools to constrain them? Because obviously what we're doing right now isn't working.
There's a part of your book, I've got here a quote where you say, global policy has stagnated because governments were too focused on global climate policy. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. It's not just a climate problem. It's an everything problem. There are reasons for which 40 years ago, when the Framework Convention was being negotiated, that countries said, look, we're just going to look at emissions. We're just going to look at this narrow slice of the problem. First of all, it was feasible when emissions concentrations were lower. And second of all, it was politically more tractable. Naomi Klein has this great chapter in her book, This Changes Everything, about how the WTO and the UNFCCC were being negotiated basically at the same time. And both of them were like, la, 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 we're not going to talk to each other, because that is just opening Pandora's box in a way that will make both of these issues politically intractable. It's not that politicians are stupid. There was a clear political rationale for this very narrow approach, but it hasn't worked. And in the interim, not only have emissions skyrocketed, but climate change has become increasingly polarized. So the more you talk about climate, the more upset people get. And that was the sort of logic of the Green New Deal or the European Green Deal. Let's not talk about climate. Let's talk about jobs. Let's talk about the economy. Let's talk about housing, transportation. Let's talk about everyday bread and butter issues that people care about instead of emissions, which is a very woolly and abstract concept to most people.
And that's a really interesting part of your book. And I suppose you don't directly blame anyone for this, but there has been this focus on emissions by governments, by policymakers, by climate advocates as well. And why do you think everybody's become so lost in that? And actually, could you explain that focus on emissions a little bit more?
A lot of the book was motivated by this fact that, I spent a lot of time looking at carbon pricing policies, carbon accounting, the voluntary carbon markets, and seeing this stuff isn't working very well. There's a big debate in the carbon pricing world about how effective carbon pricing is. I don't think it's terribly effective. Other people think that it's much more effective. But there's other areas where it's become clear, if we look at net zero or we look at carbon offsetting, that these are technical, opaque processes that are sold as measurement. How do we measure carbon emissions? But they're just as much art as science. And if you think about what a carbon offset is, most carbon offsets are avoided emissions. So you are selling on the market the absence of a thing. So imagine somebody comes to your door and says, pay me $100 and I won't toilet paper your trees, right? You're like, well, why? Because maybe you wouldn't do that anyway. I mean, that's a stupid investment, right? But yet we have bet the climate bank on offsets. People in the climate world have come to realize that, they're sort of, A, they're immoral or unethical on some grounds, and B, they're not effective. There's lots of problems, and I'd be happy to get into the weeds and talk about what those are, but there's lots of problems with, do carbon offsets actually work? And yet they remain the basis of so much of our climate policy. Anything that says net zero, the net in net zero mostly means offsets. So corporate pledges, national pledges, our aviation policy for reducing emissions, now our shipping policies for reducing emissions, they all rely on this policy that many people know to be a really lousy policy. And you can tie that to existential politics because fossil asset owners have a vested interest in saying, look, we have this solution. We're meeting our climate goals. And that allows them to largely maintain the status quo and maintain the value of their assets.
That's a very interesting part of your book. I also wanted to talk about actually carbon pricing and carbon tax. And I know that you worked on that before. And I just wondered if you could take us through the arguments that you have where I think it is that you're a critic of carbon pricing and carbon taxation as it's worked in Canada, France, and in the EU emissions trading system. I think that's really interesting.
Carbon pricing is testimony to how complicated the idea of managing tons of emissions is, that it's been reduced to this number. And that's a policy that people get, okay, it's more expensive, it's less expensive. But in reality, carbon pricing is incredibly complicated, particularly emissions trading systems, because you're essentially creating a new currency. That currency is the emissions allowance. And you're basically letting that currency float as dictated by supply and demand. So you better have good numbers about what the supply and demand are. Otherwise, your emissions allowance prices are going to tank. So I'll talk about emissions trading first, and then I'll turn to carbon taxes. So it's a very complicated process. It requires a huge amount of regulatory capacity, a lot of data, and a lot of active management. And so the successful case that I talk about in the book is the EU's emissions trading scheme, which is now about 25 years old, give or take, and is, I think you could say, a success in the sense that it has created a stable and functioning market with a pretty reasonable allowance price. I think it's about 70 or 80 euro a ton right now. I haven't checked recently. But that was a long journey, which required a lot of regulatory capacity, which of course the EU has in spades, a lot of political will. And at the end of the day, the key transformation was that they created a central bank for carbon. It's called the Market Stability Reserve. It manages the flow of allowances. And there are rules about what happens if there are too many allowances or if there are not enough allowances to regulate the price. But that requires, of course, an extraordinary amount of regulatory capacity and political will. Imagine doing that in another country of just saying, we're going to make a new central bank. There's a reason that it was climate fiction in the Ministry of the Future where Kim Stanley Robinson described such a process, because politically it is a very, very heavy lift. There are different estimates of how effective the EU ETS has been, but it's a few percentage points reduction on their annual emissions. And that is also obviously in tandem with many other types of policies. In terms of public policy, it's a very difficult thing to do. In terms of political will, it's a difficult thing to do. And finally, it makes people mad. People don't like carbon pricing. I mean, this is a fundamental rule of politics. You make things more expensive and they get angry. And then the yellow vests or the gilets jaunes were the example of this. To me, the question is, okay, it's not that carbon pricing may affect some reductions in emissions, but first of all, it's not promoting decarbonization, right? It's not promoting the energy transition. The evidence shows the reductions you get are from things like fuel switching or energy efficiency. So these aren't actually getting us off of fossil fuels. They're just reducing our consumption. So not only are you not catalyzing the energy transition, you're making people real angry. So what is the bang for the political buck here? If you're doing the calculus as a politician, it's a losing proposition because you're not getting that much reductions. You're not weaning us off of fossil fuels, and you're making a lot of people angry. As a student of climate politics, that seems like a lousy bargain.
Some of the biggest emitters are also keen on some form of carbon price.
That tells you a lot, because if you dig into the weeds of the EU ETS, the most successful, gave away free allowances, and I think until 2015 or 2016, just printing money and giving it to polluters and saying, okay, because you're heavily trade exposed or you have high cost of compliance, we're going to give you some free allowances to help defray the costs. Many ETSs are limited in scope, which actually in some ways makes sense, but you really have to look under the hood and you really have to understand all of the mechanics of how to construct this policy in order to make a proclamation about whether it's a robust policy or not. If you're giving away free allowances, if you're allowing for a lot of offsets, if there's a lot of speculation, like you can bank and borrow a lot, these are all questions about how much are you really getting polluters to transition away from fossil fuels.
And now let's also go on to net zero and what you describe as an elaborate distraction.
You got to be very precise about what you're talking about. Net zero has become sort of part of the lingo, but it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So there's net zero for countries and there's net zero for corporations. Those accounting processes are different. The accounting processes at the national level, as I talk about in the book, are a lot better. But there's still this question about embodied carbon. China is criticized for being the world's largest emitter, but about 10% of its emissions are for producing things that they export to the rest of the world. And I'm not excusing China here or whatever, but I'm just saying the way that we account for emissions now says that territorial emissions are the way that we measure, irrespective of who is actually consuming the products. So that would prompt a rethink of what we mean by net zero, what we mean by national level emissions. At the corporate level, it's a big old mess because the way that corporates do their greenhouse gas accounting is through this thing called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which subsequently became an ISO standard. I wrote about the creation of that set of standards in my first book. And the first thing to know about this is that it was created by a bunch of non-state actors. It was created by NGOs, not by governments. And they said, we need to figure out a way to measure our emissions because we think that regulation is coming down the road. And so they created this set of robust standards, but the reach of the standards, now a global set of standards, was not probably put to the same degree of rigor and certainly democratic accountability that a governmental process would have been. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol divides the world into these three scopes: direct emissions and indirect emissions. Scope 1 and 2 are direct emissions, which can be pretty readily measured. So how much electricity do you use? What are the commuting miles of your employees? Things like that. Those we can measure. When you get into indirect emissions, scope 3, what's on the supply chain, then it's anybody's guess. So if you think about Walmart has 100,000 suppliers. If Walmart was going to report all of its scope 3 emissions, it would go to each one of its 100,000 suppliers and say, what are your emissions? Which is obviously impossible. So there's a lot of selective accounting, which is necessary because it is arguably impossible to know what all of the emissions along a product supply chain are or an organization supply chain. If you think about the University of Toronto, where I am, it's all of the carbon that was emitted to build the buildings, to run the place, all of the materials that are in the buildings and that are used, the labs. It's a huge undertaking. Corporations and firms have to be selective about how they do that. But then they can just say, well, we're net zero. But again, you really have to look under the hood and say, well, does that count the buildings? Does that count the supply chains? Which part of the supply chains? And so it allows for companies to make claims that you really have to be an expert to substantiate. So a classic example of this is the Pathways Alliance, which is this alliance of tar sand operators in Alberta in Canada, which is some of the dirtiest oil in the world, have said that they're going net zero. What does that even mean? It means probably a lot of offsets, and they've had to step back on some of those claims. So this is a very difficult endeavor, and there's a huge amount of human resources and time and effort that are put into doing these measurements. And the question is, to what end? Is this the best use of the limited political will and human resources that we have to really tackle the most urgent parts of the climate crisis? And I would argue that the answer is no. And that's the argument I make in that chapter.
And so far, the actual emissions reductions for many of these things have been pretty small, if even at all.
Bang for the buck. If you're investing all this time and energy, what are you getting in return?
A good part of your book is about solutions. I guess part of your analysis leads to those solutions. But before doing that, I just wondered if I could get your view on why do you think it is that governments and policymakers have led themselves down this route around focusing on accounting and focusing on emissions themselves without really addressing the fundamental problems of supply and fossil fuel supply?
When climate change became an issue on the global agenda, it was largely a scientific problem. So it was natural scientists who were saying, this is how we measure emissions, and the line is going up. So that's one piece. It was seen as a faraway problem, and it was seen as a tractable problem. And it was the 90s, was the height of the liberal international order and the global elites and technocrats who were getting together and cooperating under the auspices of a benevolent hegemon, which was the United States. And you had climate leadership from the EU, and everything was moving together in a way that we cannot possibly imagine in this geopolitical moment. I don't think it's necessarily malicious. That's how climate started. Of course, there were obstructionists from the beginning. Fossil fuel companies knew, we know Exxon knew, we know that they were trying to dispel the science, we know that they were obstructing from the beginning. But that was counterbalanced by this, like, actually, we can do this. We can get together. We can solve this problem. It's a technical problem. We can figure out how to solve it. So I think it started that way, and then it became entrenched that way. And then fossil asset owners increasingly saw that the writing was on the wall, that they had to do something. And doing something small would forestall larger asks. And a lot of this carbon accounting were ways to do that, to say, oh, yeah, we're making changes at the margins. It's not fundamentally changing our bottom line, which is what we want. It's keeping policymakers happy. And we know now we have the technical know-how to massage the numbers or advocate for the policies to be designed in ways that are not fundamentally threatening to our business model. The creation of the voluntary carbon market, that came from NGOs who said, we want to be part of the solution. That started around the Kyoto Protocol, where they said the creation of carbon markets in the Kyoto Protocol was a critical moment for carbon accounting. So there was co-evolution of international regulations and the voluntary market and private actors saying, this is a solution too. Everybody got on the bus and said, we can make this work. And that made these carbon accounting solutions, managing tons, seen as legitimate because everybody thought, hey, this is a good idea.
You don't think it's anything to do with the fact that policymakers just didn't really want to tackle the most difficult and felt that they couldn't?
Absolutely. Yes, there have always been intransigent actors. And the problem with the UNFCCC is that it's consensus-based, which is important for a whole lot of reasons. But of course, it means that countries are collectively prisoner to the laggards, to lowest common denominator. And so, yes, there have always been intransigent actors and countries, and they have dictated the pace of decarbonization.
So it's probably a good time to go on to the solutions. You just mentioned the UNFCCC and the COP, Conference of the Parties. Maybe we could first of all go into what you talk about shifting the focus to economic institutions to be the game-changing organizations for climate policy.
I think if there's sort of one kind of tagline for the book, it's focus on dollars, not tons. Tons of emissions are problematic for all the reasons I've just explained, and focusing on dollars will help deal with this power asymmetry between fossil asset owners and green asset owners. There are ways that countries can invest in, through green industrial policy, through things like the Green New Deal, in developing their own domestic sets of green asset owners. But we also have to think about how to defang fossil asset owners. The main way that has been discussed in the global arena is through fossil fuel subsidies. It is preposterous that we put a price on carbon at the same time as we spend literally billions of dollars subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. One is meant to make carbon more expensive and one is meant to make them cheaper. So they're literally working at cross purposes. Fossil fuel subsidies have been on the G20 agenda since 2005. And obviously we have not made much progress. It is the sort of third rail. And so I acknowledge that in the book and say, okay, let's think about other ways that we can constrain fossil asset owners that are not as contentious. A technocratic solution. Tax policy as a form of climate policy. And we know that income inequality is a huge driver of carbon emissions, that the carbon inequality gap is insane. The richest 1% generate 60% of global emissions. So taxing wealthy individuals and wealthy corporations is a way to address the climate crisis. And it does a couple of things. One, obviously it generates revenue for countries to invest in other things, even if they're not climate things, to invest in other things. And two, it takes money away from wealthy fossil asset owners. There are two processes that are now underway, one in the OECD and one in the UN, to tackle this problem of corporate offshoring of profits. And not just corporate, also individual offshoring of profits. There is a serious race to the bottom. There are tax havens all over the world of countries who are slashing their corporate tax rates in order to entice investment. And the OECD has just passed it's not a treaty, it's a set of rules to require a corporate minimum tax of 15%, which is huge. If you think about taxation as one of the core functions of the state. And so for countries to get together and say, yes, we all agree to do this is a very big deal. There's a lot of details in terms of domestic implementation, but on balance, it is moving forward. Countries are passing laws to actually implement this minimum tax, including the US, obviously has its own take because it has to be special, but it hasn't completely obliterated this. It's still keeping with the spirit of this approach. And then there's also discussions outside of the OECD for a new UN tax treaty, which developing countries are pushing harder for because the UN is a multilateral institution for everyone, not just wealthy countries. That's in its very early stages. But all of this to say, there is now recognition that this is a global issue. There is cooperation on it, and there is potential for it to really help states reclaim lost revenues and their own sovereignty and say, we need this money to fund the welfare state, to address green policies, to do whatever. In an era of growing austerity, this is actually a really important step, I think.
Okay, and then another one is the use of ISDS or investor-state dispute settlements, or rather the reform of that. Maybe you could just cover that quickly.
Yeah, what I like about this solution is it stops protecting fossil fuel assets. So it's not like we're taking something away from you, therefore potentially a little bit less controversial. So the ISDS is basically a mechanism to protect foreign direct investment from arbitrary stuff, national appropriation, these kinds of things. And one of the things that goes in arbitrary stuff is overly onerous regulation, which could potentially include climate regulation. So if you're an oil company and invest in a country and the country then says, well, we have these new climate regs, so you can't prospect for oil anymore. Under the ISDS, if that relationship is protected by the ISDS, that oil company could then sue. Fossil fuel companies have made a lot of money off the ISDS. So the solution here is very simple. Stop protecting fossil fuel companies. The nice thing about this is that countries can basically do it unilaterally. They can say, we don't want our agreement governed by the ISDS anymore. For example, CUSMA, the new trade agreement between the US, Canada, and Mexico, no longer has ISDS protections. When the US wanted to sue Canada for canceling the Keystone Pipeline, that's no longer protected, so it couldn't do it. Now, Canada could probably afford it, but if you're a small developing country, that's a big expense. It's not revolutionary, but it is chipping away. I call this radical pragmatism. It's radical in that it gets to the root of the problem of existential politics, but it's pragmatic in that it is basic wonky multilateral cooperation that's already underway.
Which covers quite a lot of your solutions in the book. I suppose one of the attitudes, I think, if it's fair to say, you take is that big structural changes aren't going to be possible in the timescales required, and therefore you need to work with the system in a sense.
Yes, there are lots of smart political theorists and Marxists who explain why climate change is caused by capitalism and we have to reimagine the global order. I don't disagree with a lot of those assertions, but that's not what this book is about.
Finally, just to go through some of your other solutions, the one is around green industrial policy or industrial policy.
This shift was a moment that has since passed. When I was writing the book, the U.S. under Biden passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the largest federal climate legislation ever in the U.S. The EU has the Green Deal, which is also stepping back from some of those provisions as well. I think that countries need to think about industrial policy as their economic future, one that is compatible with their political survival. So if you compare the politics of let's make public transport more affordable, the politics of that versus we're going to put a tax on gas. Like one is obviously much more appealing than the other. So I think politically it makes a lot more sense, but also geopolitically it makes a lot more sense. I don't know if it's the same in the EU at the same level, but the US and Canada have been engaged in this sort of China bashing of, China's taking over the world with rare earths and renewable energy and blah, blah, blah. And we're going to put 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs and hope this problem goes away, which is not really a long-term solution. Countries that are really thinking seriously about what the decarbonized world order is going to look like need to engage seriously with green industrial policy. It's not just about, are we going to make stuff? It's who's going to have power in the 22nd century and how our power is going to realign. I mean, you could certainly imagine a world in which Canada said, we're going to break with the US instead of being enemies with China. We're going to pivot to developing trade relationships with them and figuring out how to decarbonize our country more quickly because they have made the investments and cheapened the technologies so that we can now adopt them. So I think there is a real place for industrial policy, both in terms of domestic politics and geopolitics. But we haven't made that sort of shift, I think, to that the shifting a mental model about what is climate change really about.
Yeah, and this green industrial policy will revalue assets as well, and that's the fundamental part of it.
Right. I mean, there's work coming out both from scholars and pundits saying there are going to be petrostates and electrostates, or there's going to be a Cold War between China and fossil countries. This is not just about widgets and wadgets. It's about who's going to control supply chains moving forward.
You touched on it before. Can we talk about trade? What you might see as solutions now in the current context?
I think moments of extreme upheaval are frightening because of the unknowns, but they're also full of possibility. This destabilization is not good on many fronts, but it does create an opportunity for countries to rethink who their trading partners are going to be, what their comparative advantage is or could be in a decarbonized economy. In the US and Canada, which I'm most familiar with, is saying, we're going to do the supply chain from soup to nuts. Ontario wants to mine all the rare earth metals and then create the batteries and then build the cars. Maybe in 30 years, that's a possibility. But in the meantime, people need cars. So I think there are different ways of thinking about this, and they involve rethinking how the global trading system is going to work. The WTO has been on life support for a long time, and I think these tariffs are another nail in the coffin of how do we rethink who trades with whom. There's this sort of flirtation with autarky of some hubristic states, but that's not real. Like that, as soon as inflation kicks in, they're going to change their tune.
A lot of the solutions in the book are quite reliant on a kind of political will and cooperation from the kind of remaining democratic, liberal-ish governments that exist in the West, much of whom are also actually heavily influenced by fossil capital still, arguably.
No book is perfect. I come from this position of radical pragmatism. The current liberal international order was built by the winners of World War II, which is part of fossil capital. in this book, we need to think about the climate crisis as fundamentally a political economic problem, and that thinking about it as a technical problem is actually damaging because it is buying more time for the status quo and for fossil capital. We need to think about this as an economic problem. There are some institutions that we may be able to use now to help address that. I've just talked about some of those. And there are some that are no longer really adequate to the task, like the UNFCCC. This is not a permanent solution going forward, but it is a step in the right direction. And hopefully, a lot of political scientists have written about climate change as a problem of sequencing. You have to build these new interest groups and coalitions to disembed the status quo and the people in power, but also will expand in scope and authority as processes continue to unfold. If we think about industrial state subsidies as a way to kickstart renewable energy at the outset and contribute to this public good, these dollars-based approaches in the current liberal international order are also a way to kickstart these political processes. They're not the end goal. They can't be. But maybe they can help level the playing field a little bit more so that we can be in a position for more profound and systemic change, which is ultimately, obviously, what we need in order to get off fossil fuels.
I did still want to ask you a question about another COP coming up. I just wondered if you could set out your thoughts about that and what, if any, role is left for the COP now and how you see alternatives developing.
Yeah, this is a tricky question for a number of reasons. It looks like the main thing on the COP, in addition to the synthesis report for the NDCs, which is not looking good because so few countries have submitted their NDCs, is this work program on a just transition. And so a lot of developing countries and a lot of the NGOs are pushing hard for this creation of a new just transition body or mechanism. This is emblematic of the privileging of process over outcome. A successful COP has some agreement on process, and often it's a new thing, which is why the COP is now collapsing under the weight of all of its mechanisms and financial mechanisms and subsidiary bodies and so on and so forth. The loss and damage mechanism is another example of that. Countries fought really hard and advocates fought really hard, and I think rightly so, for the creation of that. But it's not funded. It's poorly funded, and it's not really functional, and it's not clear that it will ever be. So I don't have a lot of hope for the COP. But on the other hand, institutions are sticky, so it's not like we're going to repeal the Paris Agreement. What I advocate for in the book is this harm reduction approach where this is no longer the only game in town. It's not where we expect real decarbonization policy to happen. We try and roll back some of the further development of carbon markets and dampen our expectations about climate finance. If you compare the numbers of the Green Climate Fund versus repatriating corporate profits that have been offshored for decades, there's no contest. What we really need to do is just manage our expectations downward.
Do you think campaigners, activists, NGOs should be essentially boycotting the COP? Are they endorsing it and indulging a kind of greenwash by attending?
I've talked to a bunch of NGOs about this, right? They're in a real pickle because, yes, it is endorsing, in some ways, legitimizing this process that is not very robust at this point, to put it mildly. But on the other hand, there needs to be transparency and there needs to be accountability. Somebody needs to be watching. I get both sides. I'm not sure what I would do. A lot of NGOs are pivoting to related issues. So just transition, adaptation, these kinds of things, which are perhaps better suited to happen in other international institutions. BLM is going to be a challenge in this way because it's so hard to get to. There's so few hotel rooms, all these kind of logistical problems coupled with what's actually going to happen. So I think we will see NGOs continuing to go because they don't want to miss an opportunity and they want to prove their worth and so on and so forth. But I'm not sure what that's actually accomplishing.
I mean, could that be also devaluing the NGOs themselves, given that, going back to your arguments in the book, they also are responsible for having focused on tonnes and emissions?
100%. I have a whole other project that looks at this very problem of them legitimating these questionable processes and policies, the exigencies of being an NGO, getting funding, showing that you've had results, being relevant to all of your stakeholders, maintaining your authority means that sometimes you have to engage in activities that are less than revolutionary, but important for continuing or more mundane organizational reasons. It's not an easy position to be in, but I think they have had for sure a role in propagating these policies.
If there were one step to take next, what do you think it would be?
I've been banging the offsets drum for a really long time, and so have a number of other very well-established climate experts. David Victor and Danny Cullenward wrote a book called Making Climate Policy Work, in which they basically say, we cannot reform this. It is unfixable. And I think if the world were to wean itself of its dependence on offsets, we would have a reckoning about climate policy. From a leverage standpoint, I think that would be a really good one, because if we can't do that, then we really have to rethink what we're doing. I think that's one. Really, we need to think about climate as a question of inequality and livelihoods and all of this kind of lingo around just transitions. And we know that people are going to need more social safety nets. People are going to need more help from the government, from fighting fires to making sure people don't die from exposure, all of these kinds of things. We need to invest in those things. And that's a pretty hard sell at this point in time.
Thanks very much to Jessica Green for her time. On our podcast blurb, you can find a link to Jessica Green's new book, which will be published in early October and is published by Princeton University Press. As usual, we also have links in the blurb to her further suggested reading on the topic. Do try and give us a review on your podcast platform if you haven't already. And thanks to Vasco Kostovsky for audio engineering the show. And I'll be back again with another interview 2 weeks from now. I'm Alasdair McEwen, and thanks for listening.